Thank you very much, Shona. Well, this new hang of Australian art at the Art Gallery of New South Wales is pretty fantastic, Wayne, Deborah. And this room, and I think the architect responsible is around somewhere as well. This room is an absolutely crackerjack room. I mean, it's called the Nolan room, but not only do we have this fabulous array of Nolans, but we've got Fred Williams, Tony Tuxon, Ian Fairweather, Arthur Boyd, Albert Tucker, the wonderful Pukamani poles, the great collection of Yolnu bark paintings. And this is a seriously powerful room. And sorry, I didn't mention John Brack and Joy Hester. There's just so many fantastic things in this room. And I feel actually slightly in awe of the greatness of the art in this room. But I'm here to talk about Sidney Nolan. In this room, not so long ago, there was the fantastic exhibition of Picasso. And it's with Picasso that we begin. And we begin in 1941 with the painting on the end of this wall. It's Sidney Nolan's depiction of Melbourne's Luna Park Big Dipper. And it's an homage to Picasso. It's got Picasso colours, those dusty pinks and pale blues. And it's got an engagement with what is essentially a cubist structure. Now, if you think about, and one of the things that we can learn from this display of Australian art here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales is responses to Cubism and to European modernism. You think about that and you think about a painting such as Eric Wilson's Abstract The Kitchen Stove from 1943, which is almost directly in the room on the other side of that wall. You can see in those responses a kind of academicised cubism, a kind of art school response, a very studied transmission of that idea. But Nolan was not an artist for whom such schooling or such an intellectual approach was appropriate. Nolan was an artist for whom the emotional punch was everything. And he embraced modernism with an originality and a vigour which I think led him to be one of the most extraordinary of the modernists in Australia. And although we're starting in 1941, this wall here gives us an opportunity, a unique opportunity, I think unique in any Australian gallery, to see the way in which Nolan found his language and found his originality. So it's a great journey, this wall, and that's the journey that I hope to take you on this afternoon. In 1938 and 1939, the young Nolan wanted to be Australia's most avant-garde artist and poet. He wrote as much poetry as he made art. And the art he made were cubistic cut-up collages of 19th century engravings. He made rapidly dashed off calligraphic drawings with a brush. He made strange prints. When he had his first exhibition in Melbourne, which hardly anybody saw, a critic said his works leave but a snail's trace of hairy line upon the paper. Nobody could actually work out what this was all about. And Nolan, when he became a painter, painted on roof tiles, he used boot polish, and he used enamel house paint. He always said oil paint is for Rembrandt and Cézanne. He wanted the direct forcefulness of commercial paint, and that's what he's used in painting the Luna Park Big Dipper, and it's what he continued to use as an artist. So he's finding very early one aspect of his language, and that's the paint he uses. 1941 is the year that Nolan leaves his first wife and daughter and throws his lot in with Melbourne's avant-garde. 1942 is the year that Nolan is drafted into the army. Nolan's army career lasts from 1942 until 1944, when he went absent without leave. And during those years, he spent his time in Ballarat at first, training, and then in the small wheatbelt towns of Victoria, Dimboola, Horsham and Nil. And he eventually ended up back at Heidelberg, just a stone's throw away from the farm Heidi, where John and Sunday Reed lived, and where he lived until he left abruptly in 1947. But in 1943, Nolan paints a self-portrait, and he paints it in Dimboola. What's striking about this picture is its frontality. It clearly owes a lot to the art of children, and Nolan was of the generation who believed that children's art was authentic and powerful because it was so direct. And it's a very, very direct self-portrait. And we notice its palette. Primary school colours: red, blue, yellow, black, white. In fact, Nolan said in 1943, I only need 5 colours, those 5 colours. That is a world to me. And he asked Sunday Reed to find him some Dulux. And although Nolan painted lots of his paintings with the more sophisticated Ripollen enamel, which was also a paint that Picasso loved, that picture was painted with pretty much standard Dulux enamel paint. And it's on a very rough piece of hessian. Okay, so it's very simple, it's very straightforward. What's he saying? He's saying, I'm in the army, Private Nolan, but I am an artist. His palette is his shield. His brushes are the tools of his assault, and it's an assault on painting. One of the fascinating things about Nolan's work in the Wimmera, he painted many paintings, he also read a great deal and thought constantly about painting, is that he was trying to find a way in which to bring the head of a child, the head of a railway guard, the head of a farmer's wife, his own head, into some kind of interesting relationship with landscape space. He does it time and time again. And I've always thought of this self-portrait as having an embodied landscape. Those bars of colour across the forehead are like a landscape. Those eyes, those pale blue eyes, are like lakes. And that curious mixture of shadow around the nose and the mouth are like the roofs and the chimneys that he'd painted in Ballarat. And on the walls behind, on the walls of he's imagining that he's in his studio. The walls of his studio in Melbourne were bright red, are 2 Wimmera landscapes. So Nolan is in Dimboola trying to engage with the landscape and wanting to declare himself an artist. And that was the passion with which he embraced his vocation. I want to leap from the self-portrait, and it is a sort of mental leap we've got to take back to Giggle Palace, which is another Luna Park painting. Giggle Palace is 1945. So what happens is Nolan begins in 1945, he's no longer in the army, to think about his own life story. And Giggle Palace is a memory of his family trip to Luna Park, and the family is lined up in front of a painted backdrop. And behind the family you can actually see the shadows. They're there to have a photograph taken. You can see the shadows which are climbing up the painting. It's got, of course, a great joke in it. The painting is a landscape which is actually a painted landscape. And that kind of ambiguity Nolan absolutely loved in painting. So Nolan begins in 1945 to think about stories in the landscape, to think about his own life, and to reflect on memory. We are now going to take a physical leap from Giggle Palace, and we're going to leap over to Hare in Trap, 1946. And just think about this for a moment. An artist who is engaged with memory, how does the memory become powerful, engaging painting on an emotional scale? I think it's through creating of memory moments of epiphany. And Hare in a Trap is an actual scene that Nolan encountered. It's a memory, and he encountered it in the company of his father. And I think it's imbued with not only the intensity of memory, but also great symbolic power. It is another self-portrait. Look at the blue eye, and then look at the blue eyes of the self-portrait. Same eyes. Nolan always used to say it was a picture about his father, who had the same blue eyes that Nolan had. But of course, it is also a self-portrait. 1946, Nolan starts to think about violence, and he starts to think about entrapment. He starts to think about the world that the Second World War has left, and he starts to think about himself in that context. And there's violence in this picture. There's tremendous poignancy as we see the injured leg of the hare imprinting the landscape with these lurid, bright red patches. By now, Nolan really has his language, and he also has his scale. And what's marvellous about this picture is the informality with which he describes the Australian bush. Just flicks the brush across the horizon, and there you have the bush. And if you all turn around and have a look at the horizon of Fred Williams's landscape from the 1960s, you can see the way in which that idea of describing the horizon of the bush, the scrubby bush, carries through from Nolan into Fred Williams. It's thinking about violence, and it's thinking about his place in the world that leads Nolan to the subject of Ned Kelly, a subject that he painted for the rest of his life, and which he began to paint in 1945. Between 1945 and 1947, Nolan painted some 45 paintings on the Kelly theme and made as many drawings and monotype prints. And what is it? What is it about Kelly that so engaged Nolan? Well, there was an autobiographical dimension. Nolan, having left the army, technically having deserted, was himself something of a haunted and indeed a hunted man in 1945, and that carries through into the figure of Kelly. And he's continuing to engage with this idea that the world has become a violent place. The Kelly paintings are actually, he said, about violence, and yet it's interesting because when we look at this, do we see it as a violent painting or a painting about violence? I don't think we do. It's hard to see that. What we see is a wonderfully, almost lyrically, beautifully painted Australian landscape, and almost a cartoon figure. Those eyes are straight out of Walt Disney. And we can almost imagine them sliding back and forth in the slot in the helmet as Kelly feels hunted on the run. We've become so used to the fact that the way in which we look at Ned Kelly was in fact Nolan's Ned Kelly, that we are in danger of overlooking the extraordinary originality of the way in which he portrayed the Kelly figure. This great invention of Sidney Nolan's, the black helmet, the figure against the landscape. So the Kelly story was a story which was fascinating not only to Nolan in 1945 and beyond, but also to a whole generation of writers and thinkers in Australia. In fact, today's talk is titled Sunlight and Violence, and it's really a line from Douglas Stewart's radio play of 1943 on the subject of Ned Kelly, where he talks about so much violence in the bright Australian sun. And there were various reasons why writers and artists were interested in Kelly, but I don't think any of them had quite Nolan's own autobiographical take on the story. And it did sustain him through many, many years. This painting is one of the 27 Kelly paintings that were exhibited in 1948 in a private gallery in Melbourne, and which became known as the Canonic Kelly series. 25 of those paintings were left with Sunday Reid and John Reid at Heidi, and in 1977 were given to the National Gallery in Canberra. One painting had been sold back in the early 40s and had been bought by the National Gallery in 1972, and this painting, which was the only one of the Kelly series not to have been painted on the kitchen table in the farm at Heidi, remained at large until, by an extraordinary connection of curatorial brilliance and donor generosity, it ended up here in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And I think it stands alone fantastically. Now, when Nolan finishes the Kelly series and leaves Melbourne for good, he comes to Sydney, where he paints pictures like this, Pretty Polly Mine. I don't think it has anything like the power of the Kelly pictures or the later engagements with the Australian landscape and its myths in the Burke and Wills story. But this picture entered this collection in 1949, so a year after it was painted in Wahroonga here in Sydney. And for a long time, it was not possible here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales to get a real sense of why Nolan is such a great painter. But now, thanks to the development of the collection over the last 2 decades, particularly the last 10 years, and with this hang, we can start to see the extraordinary power of Nolan. And the thing that I think is most extraordinary about these pictures, and this picture in particular, is its incredible freshness. This picture is as fresh and as vibrant and as direct as when it was painted. Nolan always said that he wanted his pictures to have the quality that you get when you peel a transfer off and there, bang, is the image. And this picture's got all of that. And I think it makes such an extraordinary moment in the story of Australian art here in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And to finish, ambiguity. I mentioned ambiguity. Look at that red dot. What's that? A bullet coming out of the gun? I think actually it's a wound in the landscape. Okay. Questions?